So today I'm finally making the free move Boujou tutorial that I've been promising you guys for a long time. First off, we're going to be doing this in Boujou. There's a lot of programs out there that do this kind of camera tracking. Synthesize, PF Track, Motion Tracker, even After Effects is a built-in camera tracker. But Boujou is one of the best, and that's why I'm going to be showing you how to use Boujou. The first step in tracking your footage is to actually import your footage into the program. And the program has some quirks in that it prefers high-quality JPEG sequences. Everything else is a little iffy. So if you export your footage as a JPEG sequence, that's the way to go. To start things off, you have Toolbox view, and you can see various thumbnails for different things, and you'll see import sequence. There's other ways you can access these features. You can go to Task View, and you have the same thing with cameras, masks, etc., target tracks. You can also go to File and import through that way as well. So we'll start in Toolbox view. We'll click on Import Sequence. Then I'm going to navigate to my image sequence. Select the first image, hit open. Alright, so here we have a couple options here for the image sequence. We have our move type, which is very important. We've done a nodal pan, that's easy. Now we're going to do a free move. Then we have frame rate. Now believe it or not, Boujou actually doesn't really differentiate between 23.976 and 24. This can cause the slightest bit of drift when you take things back into After Effects or 3ds Max. So it's worth keeping in mind that any images or any video files you've taken to Boujou, set them to be 24 frames per second instead of 23.976. It'll save yourself a little bit of headache and make things go well. So I'm going to set this to 24 inside the program. And then everything else is basically fine. We hit OK. Alright, so here we are working with a shot from Potion Overdose. This shot is a great example of a free move. The camera's going all over the place. And there's actually a little bit of geometry up close to the camera with the dumpster, which you'll be able to see recreated when we actually do the camera solve. So the very first step in a shot like this is track the features. But before we do that, you have to ask yourself, is there any zoom? Am I doing any zooming with my camera or with my lens? For this shot is no, but if you did, what you would do is you double click in Task View, you double click on Focal Length, and then there's an option which is Range. Just double click on that, and you drop it down to Varying. That's all you have to do if you have zooms. It can make your shot a little bit harder to solve, but for the most part it's pretty straightforward. Anyways, I'm going to leave it on constant for this, because it's a constant shot, you don't zoom at all. Alright, next up is feature tracking. So in Toolbox View, you can click on Track Feature, or in Task View, you can just double click on Feature Tracking. Doesn't really matter. This little window pops up. This is very similar to the nodal pan, in that you just simply track all your features, and that's step one. There's a couple things you can do if you have a couple issues with this. First off, if you have a lot of motion blur, you can increase your feature scale from normal to large, and it'll look for larger features rather than tinier high contrast features. Same thing if you have a shot that goes a little bit out of focus, larger features work better. Secondly, you have sensitivity, which is how many points it's putting on the screen. Keep in mind, just simply adding more points will not necessarily make things better because they need to be good points. While it may be able to find a lot more high points of contrast, if you have grainy footage, for example, they'll be jumping all over the place. And finally, you have search distance. If you have a shot that moves really fast, you might need to increase your search distance because that's the area around a point where it's going to look for where it's moved to. I'm just going to leave everything kind of at average for now. Feature scale normal, search distance 20%, medium sensitivity. You can see it has a pretty good covering of the entire frame. And we hit start. And we wait. Now, something that's worth noting is you'll see me in the foreground as the wizard, and yet there's no feature points on me. So the program's actually differentiating between me and the background. And that's because it has a basic optical flow algorithm going on. Optical flow is basically when a program actually tracks the movement of the various pixels and colors on the screen. And it's not figuring out any shape or depth to it, but it's able to tell that the background pixels are moving in one direction and the foreground pixels where I am are moving another direction. It's pretty fancy, pretty advanced, but for the most part what it means is that you don't actually have to worry about masking off things in the foreground that are moving. If you do get trouble or you do have somebody who fills a frame and you see a lot of track points on them or on any kind of moving subject, you will need to mask it off before you do a feature track. But in this case it worked great. So if I scrub through, you can see all these points with all these trails, and it's really confusing. So let's tone the trails down a little bit just so we can see the points. I'm going to go over here on the right, and we have a list of various overlays and things that we can see. You see overlays, zoom, target tracks, sequence solver, etc. So I'm on the overlays tab. Tracks is checked. If I uncheck it, tracks disappear. If I check it, tracks appear. If I expand it down, you'll see I don't really have a whole lot of options aside from checking and unchecking things. But up here I have another little tracks with another little checkbox. So there's two tracks and two checkboxes. Check them both. and it lets you see the trails. And you can control how many frames the trails last for. So for example, before, I can increase or decrease. After, I can increase or decrease. Or I can take them both down and just have the points. Now, one thing that's worth noting is if just by looking at the points, if your eyes can kind of see shape to them, if you can see how the camera's moving with just those points, like if I were to take this background image out and just be looking at the points, and I can see movement, that's a good sign that the computer will be able to solve your track just fine. Basically, if your brain is able to calculate depth from these points, then the computer can calculate depth from these points. If you just have like a flat wall, or you're just standing in place and panning, you're not actually giving the program any depth data. You're not giving it multiple points that are moving against each other that it can use to solve the camera's position. You need to make sure that when you're doing a shot for a free move, that you have things that you can track at multiple distances and that the camera's actually free moving. If you stop and you start doing a nodal pan and you return to a free move, generally things will look okay, but you're actually losing all your depth data for the moment when the camera stops moving through space. So that's worth considering when you get a shot for a free move. So this shot tracked great. It's a bright day, everything's in focus, I shot with a high shutter speed. It's pretty much the perfect shot for Boujou to track. But what if you start getting some problems? What if you have like a tree in the background and there's wind blowing, so the tree's moving a little bit and it's all tracked? Well, there's different ways you can tell Boujou what points are good and what points are bad. The very first way that's easiest is with gold points. So for example, I'm going to up my minimum here. This is going to get rid of any points that are not on screen for the minimum number of frames. I'm going to lift it all the way up to, say, 70. All right, I'm going to get some trails just so I can see them. So these points here are on screen for 70 frames. And if you watch them, they're pretty much sticking exactly where they're supposed to be. These are good, high-quality points. So I'm going to select a couple in the background here. I'm going to right-click on them. I'm going to say gold. But you know what? You don't want to just do them in one plane. You want to have them at different depths to the camera. So I'm going to select a couple others here that are on this door, much closer to the camera, and make those gold also. Making a gold point track tells Boujou that these are good quality tracks. I've looked at them. They are exactly where they need to be, and Boujou should try to make sure that the other tracks are as good as these ones, and it'll kind of use these for reference. So after you make gold tracks, you actually need to resolve your feature tracking. You can do that just by, once again, double-clicking on feature tracking, or by going to your toolbox and clicking track features. I'm going to stay in task view. I'm going to double-click on feature tracking, and I just hit start. Feature tracking deletes any original feature tracks, Yeah, okay, whatever. So, now it's feature tracking with those gold points, using those as reference to make quality feature tracks. One good rule of thumb, and I didn't really do it here, but one good rule of thumb is that your gold feature tracks, there should always be one gold feature track on frame at any given moment. And so you'll want them to overlap each other slightly. Like if we're looking at one section and we pan over to look at the other section, you're obviously going to lose the points that you just panned away from. But ideally, if you can bridge the gap with a couple other points in the middle by saying, oh, these are all gold, and making sure they're all on screen at the same time, you'll be good. All right, so we're done feature tracking with our new gold points, which in this shot wasn't entirely necessary, but I was showing you guys how to do it in case you have problem shots. So if I scrub back through, you'll see that the gold points I have are still there with their funky lighter yellow colors. I'm going to turn my minimum length for tracks down, so all the tracks are back on the screen. But we're not there yet. Feature tracking is just the computer saying, here's points on the screen. It doesn't know anything about where the position is in 3D space, and it doesn't know anything about where the camera is in 3D space. So, next step, camera solve. So I'm just going to double click on camera solves. Once again, you can go to toolbox and click camera solve. They both do the same thing. Double click on it. This stuff pops up. By the way, guys, if you're using the program for the first time, read all the words in the windows that pop up. Take your time. Programs are made to be used. They're not made to be dense and unapproachable. Anyways, sequence 1, yep, options, all frames. By the way, there's this option to optimize camera path smoothness. I usually check it. I don't quite know what it does. I think it smooths it out a little bit, but whatever. Things always look better when I check it. All right, anyways, I hit start. So now it's calculating. It tells me how long it's going to take, roughly 3 minutes or so. The faster it does a camera solve, the better your feature tracks. If the computer's really chugging on the camera solve, it means it's having a hard time trying to figure out the position of the camera based upon the features that you tracked. So you'll be able to kind of tell where the problem spots are by looking at the progress bar and seeing where it's slowing down. But in this case, it's clipping along, just kind of churning through it, really no issues. so it means that we'll probably get a good solid solve. Generally what happens when you get a bad camera solve is you get a lot of vibration and wiggle on the camera. I'm not sure if you've ever seen like bad motion capture, like where somebody has like a really crappy like motion capture suit on or something like that, and like the raw data, like they're kind of like wiggling, kind of like the Kinect. Yeah, that's kind of what happens when you have a bad camera solve. So the camera solve is all done, and I have all these blue and yellow points on my screen. If I scrub around, oh, they're actually sticking to the screen. If I scrub slowly, they're actually sticking to the screen quite well. I suppose you guys are wondering what those yellow points mean versus the blue points. Yellow points are the points that are informing the camera's position at that frame. So for example, if I'm looking at this frame here, down the alley, all the yellow points on the gate and the points that are down in the alley that are yellow, those points are being used at that moment in time to inform the program where the camera is. All the other blue points are not being used at the time, but if we scrub through, we will see that those points, those blue points, turn yellow later on, because they are being used later on in these frames. Now you can tell it's a good solve because those blue points, which are not being used, are still in the right spot and are tracking to the footage correctly. Also, up here we have some buttons, 2D, 3D, orthographic. If I click 3D, I get to see my scene in 3D. And you hold Shift and left click to rotate the camera's point of view. You hold Shift and middle click with the mouse wheel to pan, and you hold Shift and you right click to zoom in and out. And you can see the whole scene here. In fact, if I zoom in, I can actually see the dumpster right here, which is pretty nuts that the dumpster's been recreated in a point cloud in 3D space. I can also see the wall down the alleyway. It's actually really cool that this program has managed to create scene geometry from this footage.
Wow!
What's the next step? This looks like a totally great camera solve. Looking at my camera, its path is smooth. It's not jittering all over the place. In fact, it looks pretty accurate to what I did in real life. So what's the next step here? Well, the very next step is to take your scene and align it to the axes. Because, for example, we have ground that we might want to put in 3ds Max, or we might want to put decals on the wall in After Effects. And it's a lot easier to do that if everything's lined up with the X, Y, and Z coordinates. So here's how you do that. Up here at the top we have a button, and it says Edit Coordinate System or Test Objects. Right now we're on the Test Object system, where you can actually put objects in the scene and make sure they track. But I'm going to click that, and now we're in the coordinate system. And you can only do two things: translate and rotate. I'm on rotate, and the very first thing I'm going to do is just kind of line up my view here on the side, line up my ground by rotating. Pretty good. I'm going to go to move mode, move it up to ground level. And you'll notice I'm just kind of doing this in 3D view. That's fine. You can do it in like the orthographic views and that kind of stuff, but this is quick and easy. Alright, so my ground's pretty much lined up. Next up I need to line up my wall. So I'm lining it up. That looks good. Looks good. Alright, so now my scene is all lined up. So in 3D, everything matches the coordinate system. In 2D, everything sticks. I could add a test object if I want, but I'm not gonna, because I don't need to. You guys can look in the manual to figure out how to do that. And now it's time to export. So, I'm going to cover exporting to two different programs: After Effects and 3ds Max. If you're using another program like Maya or Blender or Cinema 4D or what have you, the process is basically the same. The only thing you'll really have to worry about is how it's managing your units of scale. For example, when you export this, the program doesn't know how big the scene was just by watching the video. It doesn't know if this alley is a foot long or 100 feet long. And you can tell it in the program by setting a scale, but I find it's much easier just to take it into your program of choice and scale it there. So all we need to do is make sure that when we're going to these programs, Rona, quit making all the noise. I'm trying to record a tutorial here for the internet. What we need to make sure that happens is that our scale is in a workable size when we go into these programs. From there, we can change it however we need. So, first things first, I'm going to go to After Effects. Now, all these points are actually going to export as nulls into After Effects, and that's a lot of nulls. It'll kind of bog down the program. So I'm just going to select a couple. I'm going to select a couple on the ground, a couple on the gate, a couple on the dumpster, just enough so I can kind of know where things are in my scene. All right. Next up, with these points selected, I'm going to right-click on one of them and go to Flag for Export, which flags them for exporting. All right, so Export, up at the top menu. I click on that. I go to Export Camera Solve. File name. Well, actually, I haven't saved this file yet. Check this out, guys. If you save your project, save as, I'm going to save on desktop, because I'm a baller. All right, we call this Free Moving. All right. if you save your file and you go to export camera solve, it'll automatically name your camera solve the same thing and put it in the same spot, which is great, very convenient. So, freemovin.ma, aka Maya, aka After Effects. Maya and After Effects actually can read the same camera data, which is pretty great. So, export type, After Effects. Now what do we want to do? Export our flag tracks only so we don't have a million nulls in the screen. Start frame is good, end frame is good. Scale scene by. So, After Effects measures its scale in pixels, and that's all it does. So with our scale being 1:1 right now, it's going to be very tiny when it goes into After Effects, because it's going to be like 10 pixels wide. Always scale your scene for After Effects by 1,000. If you don't, it'll be tiny. There's a way to fix that. Create a null, you parent all the camera null points to that parent null, and you scale up that parent null, and you'll scale the entire scene relative to itself. It'll be okay. But save yourself the headache, enter a scale scene by of 1,000. Oh, moving camera static scene. That's generally what you want. It's going to have all the points be static, and your camera will be moving. Save. That's it. It's ready for After Effects. Now, but what if you're going into a 3D program like 3ds Max? Well, basically the same process. Export, camera solve. From the export type drop-down, we'll pick 3D Studio Max. You don't have to export flag tracks. 3D Studio Max can handle thousands of points just fine, so I'd recommend keeping all of them. And scale scene by. Well, it's really easy to scale things in 3ds Max, but I'd just say make it 100. It makes it a little bit bigger, a little bit easier to work with. One thing that's worth noting is 3ds Max has the X, Y, and Z axes on different orientations than After Effects. So your scene might come in upside down or like pointed at the ground or whatever. That's fine. Just on your first frame, just rotate the whole scene 90 degrees, realign it, and everything will be perfect. It's also worth noting that Boujou starts on frame 1. Other programs like 3ds Max tend to start on frame 0. So if your image sequence is like misaligned and the points don't seem to like link up, same thing in After Effects, that probably means that your starting frame is off by 1. So shift it around. All right, so here I am in After Effects. I already have my image sequence. Oh, but it's at 23.976. What did I say earlier? 24 frames per second is what Boujou does. So let's interpret our footage, go to main, assume this frame rate, 24. All right. If you don't do this, it's not the end of the world. It's the tiniest drift, but if you want a really rock solid drift, everything has to be 24 frames per second. All right. Create a new sequence by clicking the image sequence and dragging it down to create a new composition. There we are. Me pretending to barf all over the place. All right, time to import the camera. Just simply double click in this space to import it. We're going to go to the desktop where I got my free move. I select that. All right, it creates a composition called free moving where we see all these nulls and there's a camera. All right, so all I got to do is take all these, select them, copy them, and paste them into my composition. And there they are. And if you look at the nulls, they stick. Everything sticks. Because we have a 3D camera moving in 3D space the exact same way that we did it in real life. And that's how you get a good camera track. Now, let's say you want to add something to the scene. Well, it's simple. Let's create a solid. All right, got a new solid here. I'm going to make it 3D by clicking this little box. And I want to line it up to those nulls if I want to make it appear to stick. So let's say I want that solid to be on the ground, right? So let me just select a null that's on the ground. There's a null that's on the ground. All right. So the easiest way for me to do this is just to do it by eye. So now my solid is lined up with those nulls, which means it's basically on the ground. And here I can see it in the main view that it is indeed on the ground. As long as I do not move it off the y-axis, it should be effectively on the ground. It's very important to note, in a nodal pan, if you put something in the frame, it sticks, no matter where it is, because the camera's just in one spot and you're just panning around. In a free move, it is very important that whatever object you're putting in is in the correct 3D space. For example, this could look like it's on the ground, but it might actually be very below the ground and far back, and it's just a trick of perspective. So you actually need to make sure that its position is exactly where it needs to be. Otherwise, it'll appear to drift. So if I scrub through, it does indeed stick to the ground. Let me demonstrate the other issue. Let me lower this, move it. So right now, it still looks like it's on the ground, right? But if I move, it doesn't stick. You can see it drifting. And I'll make it even more severe. It still appears like it's on the ground. It still appears like it's in the same spot. But once again, if I move, see how it drifts? That's because it's not in the correct 3D spot. It's actually like 20 feet below the ground. And you're seeing it because there's actually no real ground blocking it. It's very important that things are in the correct spot in 3D space. You use your nulls as a reference for that. So, you've got a sweet camera solve. You have it in After Effects or 3ds Max or whatever program you want. The objects are sticking, looks great, sweet. Good for you, nice work. I guarantee that at some point in the future, you're gonna get a shot and you're not gonna be able to solve it. It's gonna be blurry, it might be dark and grainy, and you're just pulling your hair out trying to get it to work. You can't go out and get the shot again. You had all the people you needed for that one moment, and the shot's not working. What do you do? Fear not, because Boujou is a very powerful program. I will show you how you fix that. I'm going to go back to Boujou here. I'm going to delete this camera solve. Just starting over. So I have my feature tracks. And let's say they're not high quality feature tracks. The program's having a hard time solving the scene. Here's what you do. So, here's what you do if you have a very hard to solve track. You go to Toolbox tab, you click the Add Target Track button. And you click on some point of high contrast in your scene if you can find it. I'm just going to click on the edge of this O, or whatever that is. And this works just like the point tracker in After Effects. So basically you set your size of the point that's tracking in the area around it that's going to be following or trying to follow. And down here on the right, the TT tab stands for Target Track. I can go forward a frame, and it's sticking to it, or I can go forward many frames. And just let it play. Oh, if you see there, it jumped from that corner to that corner. So I'm going to go back. There's the jump, and I can use the arrow keys to go frame by frame. I'm just going to click back on the corner to put it back on the spot. And then I can track forward, and I'm fine. So now if I go down to this timeline view, and I expand target tracks, here is my target track here. So let's say at this point, I walked across camera, and you couldn't see the target track anymore. I'd add a keyframe to the current frame, and then if there's anything else beyond it, I would right-click in that area and either clear it, or if it's obscured and it reappears, I'd say Set Range Occlusion. So for example, let's say my hand passed in front of the camera and then reappears, and then that point becomes visible again. So I'm going to click on that corner again, and you see there's this little gap in tracking. I right-click in there, I say Set Range Occlusion. What that means is, for that span, that point has been occluded by something passing in front of it. So the program will know that it's the same point, not a different point, but the same point that reappears later on. And now I can continue tracking that point. If you have at least 3 to 4 target tracks on screen at all time, you're practically guaranteed to have a camera solve. So even if the shot's all blurry and out of focus and all grainy, as long as you, using your eyes, can follow a couple points on screen and place target tracks on them, you can pretty much track anything. So, target tracks are where the real power of the program comes in. If you want to learn more about them, just open the manual. It talks about all the various numbers, what they mean, and all the various options that you have. For the most part, just imagine it like point tracks in After Effects. You just follow a point, place another target track, follow a point, and if you want to place a new target track, you just click the button again. You click somewhere else. If you want to select an old target track, right down here, there's a little button called Toggle Edit Mode. If I hit that, I'm no longer in edit mode for the target track, and I can go and select a different target track. So that little toggle edit mode is how you get out of selecting one target track and selecting another target track. You can go back into edit mode and mess around with your points. That's it, guys. This basically lets you make high-level, professional visual effects shots. You can track anything you want into a scene. The world is yours to command. Use the power responsibly. Neek's out.